Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, February 13th, 2025, and our friends Michael Hudson and Richard Wolff are back with us. Welcome back.
Glad to be here.
Let's get started, Michael, with you. And how did you find the conversation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? In your opinion, what was the importance of this?
Well, Trump was trying to make nice by acknowledging that Russia actually had a role to play in defeating the Nazis in World War II. That was very gracious of him. And all what he really did was just here's a table of contents for what we're going to talk about. Nothing very specific. I think the whole frame for this discussion is a comment by President Putin that he made a little while ago about Europe. They will gather around their master and slowly wag their tails. The interesting thing is Europe's response to what Trump and Putin talked about. Trump had no reason to talk to Europe and say, I'm going to call President Putin, here's what I'm going to say. No reason to consult them at all. And every reason not to, because America has spent the last few decades creating a leadership in Russia. People like von der Leyen and the crazy Estonian foreign minister of the EU saying that Russia's in a powerful position to attack us. And if we don't stop them in Ukraine, we're going to have to stop them in England. This is just like in the Vietnam War. If we don't stop the Viet Cong in Vietnam, they're going to be in America next. This is crazy, but it's a narrative that is aimed at the domestic audience in the U.S. and obviously European voters also, as if Russia is a threat, not a promise. And the whole idea was all along to try to isolate Russia. And I think Trump has recognized that this simply is not the case at all. And the Secretary of War that he appointed, Hesketh, was
Except,
right,
yeah,
was
exactly.
quite open in this. He said, "Look, Russia's winning. Much of Ukraine may end up in being Russia. There's no way America is going to supply troops to Ukraine. Europe is on its own." And you can imagine where this leaves Europe. It's depleted all of its weaponry stocks. And now Donald Trump and the European pro-military right wing is saying we have to spend 5% of our GDP in order to replace the stock so that Russia can't just march through Poland and Czechoslovakia and Germany and France and threaten England. And this is crazy. Europe is in a crisis now with such a high GDP, such a high demand for military without GDP growth that it's having to cut back domestic spending. And Donald Trump has been having conversations about this with Europe and said, well, why don't you send your industry over here to the United States? And Europe is thinking, oh my God, we've been abandoned. Well, that's what America does to its allies. We're back with what Kissinger said. It's fatal to be a friend of the United States, and that's exactly what's happening. So you're also having in Congress, while Trump is trying to talk to Putin and acknowledge that the problem isn't Ukraine. There's a whole war that's been going on, the whole NATO war, the whole Cold War, of which Ukraine is only a single front. He's trying to he acknowledges the need to take the whole big picture into account, including Russia's needs for its own self-defense, meaning there's not going to be a European peacekeeping force, meaning British terrorists bombing Russia from right behind the demarcation line. Trump is, and Peskov, I'm sorry, the Secretary of War, have taken a realistic point. And the interesting thing is how much this is being attacked in Congress by the Democrats. Who lost Ukraine? They're trying to say we had a chance to win in Ukraine under Biden. Biden didn't give them enough bombs. He didn't give them the atom bomb. He didn't let them show how strong America is. You're hearing these bizarre uh, democratic political America strong comments. And the fact is, the issue isn't who lost Ukraine, how who enabled Russia to be so strong that now, 3 years into the war, Russia is in such a strong position that that Trump, the president of America, and his cabinet are saying, okay, the Biden strategy, the neocon strategy of trying to fight to the last Ukrainian and thinking this is going to exhaust Russia's military academy, military capacity, that's all gone by the line. Russia's military ability and army and arms are much stronger. Europe's arms are depleted, and politically at home, the voters are turning against the Ukraine war and against the poverty of ever having split away from Russia and China in the first place. So now there's an irreconcilable approach, and the screams that you're getting from Europe, these are the people that are on automatic pilot that the United States has pushed into commanding heights. Von der Leyen, as I said, the Estonian, and they are unable to follow Trump's realistic, at least, approach to sitting down and talking. Uh, and it's crazy. But the one thing that I'm sort of amazed at that Trump has been bringing up with Putin is, well, we've spent $500 billion in Ukraine. Now we want the money back. We want its raw materials that happen to be in Donetsk and Luhansk. We want their lithium. We want their raw materials. And Zelensky sold them fair and square to American firms. Oh, that's crazy. We can talk about that later. I'll let Richard pick up what's happening here. But you're having a real clash of the participants don't understand, don't agree on what the reality is, on the basis of which to make an agreement. At least Trump and Russia are a little bit closer. Europe is not close at all, and Europe is being excluded, just as Zelensky's being excluded, is not relevant.
Richard?
Yeah, let me try to add some context to this. When the United States gets itself into moments of extreme difficulty, which happen periodically, it's not just now. I think it's worse now than it has been, that, as we've discussed on this program many times, that we are in a period of a declining empire. That's a 100-year project that was built up. It's now declining. And we're also at a time when American capitalism is not only losing its empire, but also losing its position within the world economy. And those two things are related, but not exactly the same. So that's a very serious challenge to its future. And I want to go back and look at another moment of challenge. At the end of World War II, it was a moment of extreme difficulty for the United States. Why? Because the thing it feared most, the Soviet Union, was left standing. The hope that Hitler and Stalin would each destroy the other and that they would be both gone when it was over had turned out not to work out. Hitler was gone, the Nazi machine was gone, but Stalin was, if anything, stronger than he had been before. And the proof of it is the Eastern European corridor from the Baltic states in the north through Bulgaria in the south. They were strong. And then something happened that made it really extreme, namely the most populous country in the world, China, joined the Soviet Union, completed its revolutionary civil war, ejected Chiang Kai-shek onto the island of Formosa, about which the United States could only pretend, then as now, that they had a chance to control that country, that little area's future. And then here's the point. Republicans and Democrats stopped their comfortable Tweedledum, Tweedledee exchange. A few years for you, a few years for me. None of that looked as though it could work. There was a real crisis. And the Republicans then took the position of excoriating the Democrats by saying, you lost China. Hence the parallel with what Michael said, you lost Ukraine. The interesting thing is the reversal. In the 50s, it was the Republicans who rode that claim into office. And now it's the Democrats who hope to ride that claim into office. It worked so well for the Republicans that for the next 40 to 50 years, anti-communism, because that was the way this was framed, anti-communism, undoing the evil influence of communists who had engineered the loss of China. This story could be told and retold to produce a global movement against Russia, NATO, and to promote an Asian equivalent, and to promote inside the United States a half-century worth of relentless ideological battle against first the communists, who were converted from militant New Dealers into agents of a foreign power. As soon as the communists were killed, you had the movement across America to teach the American people that socialists, because we had two strong socialist parties here, that socialists are just like communists. The only difference is they spell it differently. The words are different, but it's all the same. And you can't be a communist and you can't be a socialist because you are literally a military political threat. They deport. I want to remind people, the United States deported folks because they had been members of the Communist Party. And they defined membership in the Communist Party as the equivalent of advocating overthrow of the United States government by force and violence. That's a quotation. In other words, they defined membership in a party as an imminent violent threat to the social order. Okay. I want to argue that we are in a comparable crisis. This time it doesn't have anything to do with socialism and communism because of the American need to pretend that that issue is resolved and part of ancient history. So the crisis now is the collapse of the empire, the war that was lost in Vietnam, the war that was lost in Afghanistan, the war that was lost in Iraq, and now the war lost in Ukraine. This is not a good record for the last 30, 40 years. It's awful. And you can't keep pretending that it isn't. And likewise, long story short, the rise of the BRICS, who now have a collective GDP significantly larger than that of the G7 on the Western side, they now have 60% of the world's people and more than the United States and the G7 worth of wealth. I mean, it becoming literally impossible not to realize that the American dominance is over. It was already being challenged when China joins the Soviet Union. But now the challenge is, if anything, bigger and deeper and more frightening. So what do you get? You get a level of turning on each other between the Republicans and Democrats that even makes World War II anti-communism look mild by comparison. People are now threatening each other in the halls of Congress. We saw that at January 6th, a few years ago. They wanted to hurt each other. They wanted to kill each other. And that means something. Okay, now to the immediate presence. One of the things that happens in a declining empire, and we've seen it in earlier declining empire periods, is that the center of the empire begins to jettison, to throw away its own allies. It's a little bit like an airplane having difficulty deciding to throw its cargo overboard in hopes of lightening the plane and getting a few more miles to a safe airport. That's done all the time. The United States is now, thanks to a kind of reckless Trump, who, having defined himself as different from the establishment, as against all of their follies, and to do so with brash, bullying, theater. So he uses that theater in the 3 or 4 weeks he's been in office to kind of overwhelm the world. And it's mostly theater, and much of it will come to nothing. But there's a kernel that's part of this larger context that I want to end with. Putting 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, talking semi-seriously about Canada being the 51st state, this is throwing your allies under the bus. Mr. Trudeau has now a very difficult choice: to enrage the United States and hurt the economy, or to pander to Canadian nationalism by being the one who says, I will quote him from last night, Snowball's chance in hell is if they ever become the 51st state. Okay, he wishes he was not in this situation, because in the end, he loses either way. He's gambling on which will be the lesser cost to him. That's all. You have a little different situation in Mexico, but it is really profound. Ever since NAFTA, we're now talking 30 years. For 30 years, the United States actively encouraged enterprises, American and foreign, to set up shop in Mexico and Canada in order to take advantage of the whole point and purpose of NAFTA, which was the free trade area. And he simply, Mr. Trump, by what he's doing, is nullifying much of that investment, making it worthless. 25%, if he actually means it. And if it doesn't work, who knows? He may raise it. He's raised tariffs elsewhere. I believe today, at some point, he's going to raise global tariffs again. All right. Here's the economic absurdity. What capitalist in his right mind would undertake to move production, say, out of China or out of Vietnam or out of anywhere, and either back to the United States or to Mexico or to Canada? In a situation like this, that would be lunacy. It takes years to move production. It takes huge amounts of money. At best, it's a risk. But with this president and the way he acts and the level of problems he's encountering, you'd be even crazier than normal to undertake. So the promise of Mr. Trump to reshore American industry by virtue of these tariffs is ridiculous. That's not going to happen. It's kind of an economic warfare. That's what the sanctions against Russia were. Look how well they did. Not at all. This is just another version by the same idea. Use the economic power of the United States, as Michael said a few moments ago, as a bomb threat all the time. But these threats are becoming empty. The sanctions against Russia, the Russians mocked them, and they're the ones laughing all the way to the bank. And now the United States, angry at Biden for a failed economic warfare of sanctions, is lining up behind Mr. Trump's parallel economic war of tariffs with all of these crazy promises. You know, when I taught economic trade, international trade, if you've ever taught that in a university, and I have, and you look at the textbooks, which I've done, they all have sections on tariffs because tariffs are old. That's not a new idea. Countries have been doing that for centuries. So there's a vast accumulated literature on when they work and when they don't work and why they work when they do and why they. Given all of that, the glib promise that this tariff is going to have all of these wonderful consequences strikes me as exactly as idiotic as the notion that if you took away Europe as a market for Russian oil and gas, Russia would implode because there's no one else to buy the oil and gas. It took Russia a few weeks to find the alternative, namely India and China, that bought the gas and the oil. End of conversation. The only interesting thing about that story is the capacity of American policymakers not to have taken into consideration what could happen from their economic warfare. They are doing exactly the same thing. The same people who mocked Biden for the failed economic sanctions are now lining up with the same chorus and the same lopsided ignorance promising the moon from this tariff war. It's extraordinary to watch, and it all makes sense if you see that this is a declining economic system flailing around, trying this, trying that, not worrying about the contradictions, not worrying about its own lessons. Mr. Trump is heaving tariffs while he actually sits down with the evil Russians to work out the partition of Ukraine and Europe. Amazing, amazing to me.
Yeah. Michael, go ahead.
Well, I want to start my commentary where Richard began and try to follow the sort of long spiral of one thing leading to another, because one thing does lead to another and did. He started by pointing out the parallels between the end of World War II and today, and that's a good parallel. The United States and Europe, 1930s all through World War II, wanted Germany to bleed Russia and destroy it, and somehow lead to a regime collapse of Stalin's communism. That didn't work. But today again, they're repeating the strategy. They want to use Ukraine and Germany, which is the most anti-Russian, pro-military country, to bleed Russia and bring about a regime change at great cost. Well, Richard rightly pointed out that this the way in which World War II ended was on a way that established Europe's dependency on the United States. And if you look at how this happened in the nitty-gritty, the United States and Britain in 1944, 1945, sat down to decide the post-war world, how they were going to lend Britain the money to recover and the cost was to break up the British Empire. That Britain had to abolish imperial preference, talk about protectionism. Britain had to give up the fact that during World War II, India, Argentina, and other countries had built up huge holdings of sterling. And Britain had hoped, well, when peace comes, they're committed to spend this holding of the sterling that they've built up during the war. They're going to spend it on us, and that'll enable us to recover. Well, England sat down with the U.S., and the U.S. negotiator said, look, you're going to be broke and you'll go bankrupt, and we're not going to lend you the money to get by and support your currency unless you give up the sterling area, make free trade. And England said, well, wait a minute, our industry's been destroyed. If people can, if we get rid of capital controls, and India and Australia and Argentina and other countries can spend these World War II savings anywhere, then it's all going to go to the United States. And the US said, well, that's it. Well, the House of Lords had a big debate in 1944, and they realized that the Churchill and government was giving away the whole shop because Churchill was very pro-American. He didn't mind England giving up the empire to the United States because he thought there really wasn't an alternative. So the U.S. and Britain together designed this post-war pro-U.S. world that Richard discussed, and the continental Europeans were not consulted at all. The Anglos' U.S. agreements for the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and free trade and no capital controls was presented to Europe as a fait accompli. Well, let's see the parallel today. Trump realizes that he can't really use a deal with Europe and confront Russia and say, well, we've agreed with Europe on what the post-war order is, and Europe insists that we put European troops and atom bombs right on your border so that we can knock you out in 5 minutes if we don't like what you're doing and we want to do to you today what we failed to do in 1945. Well, obviously that's not going to work. That was the neocon policy. That was the Biden policy. The idea of American empire was we can bomb any country that doesn't submit to our kind of rule. Finally, the U.S., or Trump at least, has dropped all that. So if he can't use Europe to confront Russia, what he can do is talk to Russia and say, okay, we're not involved with Europe. We know that Europe right now is attacking you in the Baltic, attacking you in the North Sea. They're trying to stop your shipping. We know that there are Nazis. We know that the Nazis in Europe, in Germany especially, want to do to you now what they didn't do in 1945 and World War II, but we're going to leave them to their own devices. We're not going to spend more money on Ukraine, meaning the Cold War. And if Europe wants the Cold War with you, Russia, they'll have to spend it themselves. And we know they don't have any money because their hatred of you, their revived Nazism, don't have anything to do with the Russians. Their agreement with Zelensky in Ukraine that the Russians are Slavic and the almost racist hatred of Russia leads them to not want to import Russian gas. It's lead them to create economic suicide. Trump has said, well, the European dreams of empire are gone. We're not going to let, we're not going to join their suicidal, self-destructive hatred and behavior. We're going to try to break that. And I, Donald Trump, am going to try to save our relationship and the hopes for peace from the neocons in my own administration. I'm trying to clean out the CIA. I'm cleaning out the State Department. I'm cleaning out the FBI. I'm cleaning out all the AID and the regime change, National Endowment for Democracy, and all of the covert activities of the United States. All these are being cleaned out so that we can now have the kind of at least nominal equality that you, President Putin, have been talking about all these years. So Europe's left out of the negotiation, and there's really nothing that it can do except in a rage. Now, is America's policy is it also is losing its empire, as Richard has just been describing? Is America going to emulate Europe in its self-destructive policy by somehow refusing to acknowledge that the Cold War really is over? I think there's part of Trump to say, well, it's Cold War isn't over. We're just changing the venue. Where it's not going to be a military fight in Ukraine or in the Near East or in China. We're going to use economic force, and Trump says, well, we're going to deal with that part of the empire that we know that we can hold. We're not going to try to draw Russia and China and Asia into the empire, but we're going to draw not only the Western Hemisphere, Canada, Mexico, and Latin America in, but our satellites in Europe. That's going to be part of our empire. At least we can survive drawing money from them. And he's outlined all sorts of policies that I could go on, but that's for later part of this discussion today. So I think that in that sense, he's redefined the American empire, is not including an attempt to take over Eurasia, not trying to defeat Russia and China, but trying to figure out some way to work with them in a way that America can somehow work with them and come out ahead in the deal. That's where he gets into the fantasy land, thinking that somehow he can make a deal where we win, you lose. And the next stage, probably by somebody else, will be if a regime in America comes and says, yes, the Cold War is over, we're going to take our half of our 15% of the world population, English speaking in Western Europe, the 85% can go its way. We'll try to deal with them as best we can without making a structured world financial system, without weaponizing international finance and international trade in the way that Trump is still trying to do. So that's the dynamic that is at work right now.
Richard.
Yeah, let me add, and I understand that this is a speculation, and I understand that nobody can predict the future. Most of what Michael said makes perfect sense to me. I want to add a couple of things. First, there has always been, as part of everything Michael described, another kind of fantasy that has captured quite a few people in Washington. And it is currently capturing more, partly because everything else isn't working. And that is to try to build an alliance with Russia against China. In other words, to flip the coin, to say that the Democrats held on way beyond what they should have to a Cold War that had run out of gas long ago and wasn't relevant anymore. Communists were not in charge of Russia anymore, and were eager not to go back in that direction, and that they therefore might be persuaded with the appropriate mixture of incentives and threats to consider an alliance with the United States, mainly built around anti-Chinese racism, maybe all kinds of possible combinations that the United States could find perfectly amenable. I don't think that's gone away. I think that's still there. And my suspicion is that when Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin get together, this will also be discussed, even if only as each one feels out how much support there might be for moving in that direction. And my understanding of the wisdom of the Chinese is they've thought of that also. And they also consider how that might happen and what that might mean. And then all of them might, get together. The Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, and decide that the lubrication for a rearrangement among them would be carving up Europe amongst them, so that the feeding off of a dying Europe, which would bring full circle the colonial period, simply reversing who's colonizing who. After all, that's the history of the United States and Britain. We were the colony, they became our colony, which they still are. Watching Keir Starmer be a gung-ho supporter of Ukraine verges on the obscene. It's so crazy. But that's what happens when empires die, when empires get desperate and don't know what else to do. I may make fun, and Michael and I may make fun of Trump's efforts, but they also have a pathos connected to them, a desperation of trying some way to avoid what is going on. And it's not working. Mr. Trump has to do much more of his theater in his second presidency than he did in his first, because his first didn't accomplish very much. It's already been forgotten. Other than the big tax cut in December of 2017, what? Didn't do anything. Certainly didn't stop the great issue, the decline of the empire, the growth of BRICS. If anything, he stimulated it to go even faster. And then the Biden even faster than that. But I don't think it's their fault. I think it's a process they are unable not only not to stop it or reverse it, but even to guide it a little bit seems out of their reach. But I am mindful that here in the United States, thanks to the mainstream media and how it is subservient, that none of these sorts of questions and ideas and analyses and speculations. And I'm sure Michael and I, we make our mistakes, the things we don't see, but we are all alone. I mean, not all literally, but there's very few of us daring to talk like this. The mainstream media are still engaged in massive denial of most of this. There's a reason half of Americans are not aware that Vladimir Putin and Joseph Stalin are not two leaders of a continuing dangerous Russian threat. I've encountered it too in public speaking. I have to explain that something happened in 1989 and 90 that was actually important, because for them. And then one day I had a little moment, a little mini epiphany, when I realized that Biden and Antony Blinken, they haven't understood it either. Russia is still for them the great bugaboo problem. It's extraordinary how denial can feature in the way individuals, populations, and the whole world can, at least for a while, delude itself.
Well, the fantasy that Richard's describing, that somehow Trump and the Americans can convince Russia to join China, is actually being discussed in the United States. So it's not his fantasy. He's describing the fantasy that somehow the United States can trigger the antagonism towards China to at least have one enemy to justify all of this enormous military and industrial spending. And I think one of the things that Trump is trying to cut back and trying to cut the deficit. Remember, let's talk about his nutty economic philosophy. He thinks that if you cut the federal deficit, somehow that will stop inflation and make the American economy more powerful and enable it to reindustrialize. And his way of cutting the deficit is not only to stop spending in Ukraine, the 500 billion that he's claimed, but to stop the military spending in general against China. He would love to have Europe pick up any of the Cold War expense, but to shift the focus of NATO away from Russia. The North Atlantic Treaty Association is now the West Pacific Treaty Association, and the fight against Taiwan and China. This is so. The reason this is nutty is because it assumes that other countries will simply say, okay, we can just change our alliances like that and go back and forth, and that this will somehow persuade other people to trust us, not to shift again and then turn to China and say, okay, we'll join with you, and now we can carve up Russia and give you Russia's natural resources to you, which also is discussed. So all that Russia and China have to do is to call Trump's bluff and say, well, we're not going to do that. We've met with President Xi, and you, America, and your European puppy dogs wagging their tails have driven us together, and it's done. You've driven us together, and we're an alliance. Let's talk about something else. Next topic. And this calling the bluff is not only available to Russia and China, but since Richard mentioned Canada and Mexico before, other countries can say the same thing. The United States can threaten to disrupt Canada's trade in aluminum, steel, and other imports here. And Mexico, certainly, maybe even little Canada, can say, well, if you're saying that you don't want the economic relations that we negotiated under NAFTA in good faith, thinking that once you negotiate a treaty, like you're asking Russia to join against China, you can just turn. We're going to have to find someone more dependent. So we're looking to China to depend. NAFTA has had the effect on destroying our agriculture by letting free trade in grain enable American farm producers to undersell grain prices. And so our farmers have gone out of business. But now we can, we're not in that anymore. We can have the same kind of agricultural protection policy that President Roosevelt designed in the 1930s that protected American agriculture and promoted an enormous capital investment in productivity, agricultural extension services, new seed varieties, marketing services. We can turn to China and says, we know that you're going to, you don't have anywhere near as much farmland as you have population, and we know that the drought is affecting many of your areas. Let's make an alliance, an economic alliance between Mexico and China, and we will try to grow the crops that you want. You will provide us with what we used to depend on the United States on. In other words, they can call the bluff and maybe very conspicuously have meetings with China, and it's as if ultimately Mexico would be joining the BRICS. And if Mexico can do it, think of Latin America, who the United States has imposed military dictatorships to prevent land reform and prevent Latin American agriculture from growing its own crops in competition with U.S. grain, and to grow plantation crops. Latin America can fight the same fight against the large landowners that Mao fought against to create Chinese agriculture. That all of a sudden, if once you realize that you don't have to be a subordinate member of the American empire, then you all all of a sudden you can calculate what your actual self-interests are and what you want. I know a lot of your listeners are not Americans in baseball, but the metaphor that I'd find would be the New York Yankees. The New York Yankees had a blustering owner, Steinbrenner, who owned it, and he'd worked, headed a consortium that bought the Yankees and got very, very rich from it. And he would keep doing spontaneous, idiosyncratic things, very much like Donald Trump. They're like very, very similar. And one of the partners, who maybe had a 10% share, minority share, said, "There's nothing more limited than being a limited partner with Steinbrenner and the Yankees." Well, there's nothing more limited than Europe or Russia or any other country trying to be a limited partner with the American Yankees. And I think that there's a perception of that, and they're realizing if we want our self-determination, I mean, it's not only that other countries in the BRICS are saying we want to make our own policies. We don't want U.S. diplomats to weaponize world trade and investment to serve the U.S. We want to develop our own policies. What if America's allies said the same thing? We're in the same fight. We want to do our policies, and the fact is that we made an awful mistake in cutting off Russian gas. That it was America that weaponized the gas trade by saying, buy from us at 4 times the price you're charging Russia, that Russia is supplying you with. Well, we're in the same situation. People, for the first time, Europe could get its independence that it was manipulated into giving up largely with British acting as the U.S. patsy in 1944, 1945. Europe can say we don't have to be part of the Anglo-American neocon plan anymore. I think gradually you're going to see some kind of sanity emerge along these very lines. And I think when Richard describes the breakup of the American empire in the way he has, you can see how the strategy that the Americans are using is catalyzing the breakup by creating such a reaction abroad that other countries realize there is an alternative. For the first time, they're thinking of the alternative. And as Richard points out, this is not being discussed in the popular press, but it's being discussed right here on this show.
You know, I'm tempted, because you know I do this from time to time. So I'm tempted to quote Hegel, the German philosopher, who taught us about contradictions and opposites. Here's a rule that comes out of it, and he may have talked about it himself. I just don't remember at the moment. But the way you function as a hegemon is by never functioning like a hegemon. In other words, the United States' position as dominant depended on never weaponizing that situation. Because what that does is provoke in the people you control the need to get out from under your control, and therefore it negates itself. What you see now is the United States as hegemon doing the weaponizing and the fighting, and that is the contradiction. It can't do that. That's not how you preserve your hegemonic status. You have to be able legitimately to manage it all. It's like a government that suddenly represents only these 20% of your people. Yeah, but then the other 80% feel abandoned and your days are numbered. You've just violated the rule of what a hegemon has to do. Everyone in Mexico and Canada had agreed that, of course, we are overwhelmingly dependent on our huge neighbor, the US. Now everybody in those countries is discussing how the hell do we get out of this? This is not a dependency. we can risk. Wow, that's the end. I don't know what way out they will find, but boy, starting at the top, their leaders are discovering, I got to get a way out of this, otherwise my career is gone. And 8 million other Canadians are trying to figure that out. If the U.S. is an export market, if the U.S. is an input source, or whatever. Trudeau, in his speech, thanked Canadians who had changed their holiday plans and were no longer going to visit friends and relatives in the United States, but were finding other places to go and take their vacation. This is very, very bad for the United States. Just, 12 ways that's terrible, none of which are discussed here, as if we glide over all of that. You can't cannibalize your own allies. It is just, wow. And I'm wondering, as a logical question, the efforts of the Chinese to find partners in Europe has been going on for quite a while, and they found some. My guess is they're going to find a lot more. A lot more experimenting is going to be done below the surface or even publicly, in which this or that entity finding itself in a tough spot in Norway or in Portugal is going to be approached by Chinese investors, Chinese companies, Chinese diplomats, who will offer them a deal they cannot afford not to take. And there it is, step by step. The United States policy was to isolate Russia and China. The end result, they've isolated the U.S.
Well,
Michael,
Richard pointed out the role of the narrative in all this, and the fact that somehow the Canadians and Europeans have been, following this false narrative. Not in the last week, with all of Trump's attacks on the AID and the State Department, all of a sudden we find how AID has been financing all of the major media publications throughout the world, and they've turned reporters into essentially just passing on the talking points of the CIA and the State Department. All of this created artificial narrative coming from the neocons have suddenly been exposed all over the newspapers. They're all talking about what Politico has been funded, the talk shows, the internet shows, the newspapers, the New York Times, what we thought was the news for the last 50 years has all been part of the fictitious narrative to distract people from talking about what you and Richard and I have been talking about on this show now for quite a while. All of this is now out in the open, and now all of a sudden, this has opened the path for a new narrative to discuss the very points that we're discussing. And that is what's going to lead people to suddenly think, wait a minute, we've been living in a tunnel vision describing all of this. We don't have to fight China. We don't have to fight Russia. There can be a world where we all gain together if we just don't have the United States grab the whole pot for itself. That's the transformation of the narrative goes part and parcel with the transformation of the real relationships that are leading to the fall of the unipolar American control.
Yeah,
before Richard, just before wrapping up, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I want to put it in context. I don't want to be heard of as sort of blaming the United States. I understand why it sounds like that, and that is what has happened. But the only model that American leadership had was the model of the British Empire. We have to remember that this is a country that was part of it, that lived for many, many years under the British empires rule. And that, yes, it had a little bit of anti-colonialism as it broke away. But given the way the world worked, it inherited the colonialism of the Europeans, above all the British, which, after all, was the most enormous and successful of those European empires. So we ended up in this Hegelian contradiction. We espoused anti colonialism, but we in fact replaced one colonialism with another. And that is a very foundational contradiction. And we've been playing out the lack of a recognition of this, let alone a policy that would try, at least somehow, explicitly to acknowledge that and to get beyond that. We never did that. So we just act out verbal anti colonialism on top of, as a veneer over the actual colonialism. And nothing shows this more than a sudden burst in the last month of a whole new spurt of we're going to take Panama, we're going to take Greenland, we're going to take Canada. I mean, it's incredible how this surges back up out of nowhere and scares all the old ex-colonial countries as they contemplate, oh my God, are we going backwards in history? And the answer is that too is a typical symptom of a declining empire.
And beachfront Gaza too.
Yes, I left it out. My mistake.
Another show.
Yeah. Just before wrapping up, Bloomberg and Financial Times both reported that there are two concerns on the part of Europeans. One of them is that European countries are sidelined in negotiations over Ukraine. And the second part is the European officials are increasingly concerned that the United States will offload the heavy burden of post-war security and reconstruction of Ukraine onto them. This is the main, Richard, Michael, when they're talking about Europeans, it seems that in the mind of the current administration, they don't care about what Europe feel about what does Europe feel about the situation in Ukraine? Because after all, we know that Russia is looking for some sort of security architecture for the future of the region, which Europe is part of that security architecture. It's how can we just single out or just ignore Europe in these negotiations?
Well, Europe is working against everything that Trump is. The question is, what is Europe? And the European Union, von der Leyen and the NATO leadership, NATO really isn't the Europe that Richard and I are talking about. We're talking about in industry, labor, the wage earners, the population, not the narrow layer of NATO and the captive AID functioned finance press in Europe. So Europe itself has been hijacked by NATO and by the American mighty Wurlitzer, the propaganda machine that's been taken over. So the question is, when will Europe rediscover what it means to be Europe in a way that is not a U.S. satellite?
Yeah. Also, let me just add, I know this may be disturbing, but I listen carefully to what the Russians say, and they say what you say, Nima. We're concerned about a European security architecture. But to be honest, I have no idea what they're talking about, and I don't think they do. What does that mean? A guarantee? There is no guarantee. Everybody who's ever offered a guarantee discovered that at a certain point it wasn't a guarantee. The NAFTA that was renewed under Trump's first presidency, he signed as the president He signed the treaty that he has now simply thrown aside. Okay, I get it. I'm not surprised, but it is what it is, and it says making treaties means nothing. If the person you make a treaty with gets himself into difficulty, what treaty is his response? There is no treaty. And what is it the Russians want? They want a security that Europe will not attack Russia. There is no such thing. They don't worry about Europe, rightly, because right now Europe couldn't possibly attack Russia without being defeated, and badly. So Russia kind of knows that, of course, they have to sit down with the United States, because that's the only serious threat they now face, assuming that their alliance with China is in good shape, which it seems to be. So yes, they sit down, but there's nothing to discuss with Europe. I mean, whatever they agree, Europe will have to go along. What options does it have? Now, it may be that you begin to have voices in Europe, hopefully with political muscle, that are arguing either to end the fiction of a united Europe, because it isn't. I mean, in France, the left is powerful. In England, there isn't a left. Okay, these are important differences. How are you going to work that out? Let alone how you deal with Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, which is a rising political force in an economy whose GDP is negative, is shrinking. So I don't understand. I mean, Europe is being thrust aside, but that's the fruit of half a century of economic development that happened everywhere else more than in Europe. And if you exclude Germany, then way more than in Europe. And Germany is now excluding itself. And consequently, this is a drowning part of the world that says, hey, remember me. And everybody else says, remember you. You're going under the waves. You're gone. We can't even reach out to you anymore because you're irrelevant. So I think that what they mean, and all that they could mean, is some sort of way to end the war in Ukraine, having made it as much more difficult for the West to intrude on Russia as they can. It just to throw a handful of limiting things so that they are a little bit safer than they were before. And then the Russian leaders, from Mr. Putin on down, will have to hype to their own people how much of an architecture they put in place. But whatever they say, it'll have the deep abiding force that NAFTA had.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Richard and Michael. Great pleasure as always.
Okay, we'll hold our breath as we watch what happens to poor Europe. I want to remind you, my mother was born in Berlin and my father was born in the city of Metz, France. I've been speaking French and German since I've been a kid. I learned it before I learned English, even though I was born in the United States, but I didn't speak it until I was thrown into kindergarten. So I am half a European. I follow events in Europe. I love the French language. I love the German culture. It is sad for me to watch how poorly the capitalist system has preserved, let alone built on, the Europe that it inherited from feudalism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.